Hello, and welcome to History 3300, the history of women in North America. And online, we will be finishing up our last few lessons together. Please remember that I want you to watch the uploaded PowerPoint slideshow at the same time that you watch these videos, or go back and forth between them so that you can actually look at the video links that are embedded. Let's start our lesson on women and the Great Depression. I want to start this lesson with an anecdote. During the Christmas season, one Depression year, an Eaton saleswoman witnessed throngs of little girls admiring Shirley Temple dolls. And you can see the actor Shirley Temple playing with the doll herself. Please click on the Shirley Temple link for a little bit of information about how important Shirley Temple actually was to the movie business at this time. Now let's get back to the dolls. Priced between $9 and $16, the dolls cost a month's income for a family on welfare. I'd like you to write that down. The dolls cost a month's income for a family on welfare. A saleswoman recalled that some children, quote, used to come at opening time and just stand there looking at those pink-cheeked, golden-haired, lovely Shirley Temples. Little faces, they needed food. You could see a lot who needed a pint of milk a day, 1,000 times more than they needed a Shirley doll. They'd stare for hours. We tried to shush them away, but it didn't do any good. This, mind you, went on day after day until some of the girls thought that they would go crazy. One clerk had a crying fit over just that. Those hundreds of poor kids who would never own a Shirley Temple in 100 years. They were lucky if they had breakfast that morning or soup and bread that night. Now, this moving account speaks volumes about Canada in the interwar years. With its creation of desire through advertising, corporate capitalism touched most people, including children. In the 1920s, many ordinary Canadians acquired some of the dazzling array of goods improved technologies made available. But there was too little money in the hands of shoppers to buy all that the industrial system produced. By 1933, the value of Canada's exports was less than half of what it had been in 1929. The unemployed and underemployed seemed to be everywhere. I'd like you to write this down. In 1929, the average yearly wage of $1,200 was $230 below what social workers estimated a family needed to live above the poverty line. So that wage of $1,200 was $230 below what social workers estimated a family needed to live above the poverty line. On Black Tuesday, which was October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression, the worst economic collapse in the history of modern industrialism. It spread from the US to the rest of the world, lasting from 1929 until the early 1940s. Please take a look at the Black Tuesday clip. The economic downturn was further amplified by a severe drought which ravaged Western provinces and left the wheat belt in America a dust bowl. Please take time to look at the clip entitled Dust Bowl. By 1934, it had turned the Great Plains into a desert. A letter from an Oklahoma woman published in Reader's Digest said in 1935, quote, "In the dust-covered desolation of our no man's land, wearing our shade hats, with handkerchiefs tied over our faces and Vaseline in our nostrils. We have been trying to rescue our home from the wind-blown dust which penetrates wherever air can go. It is an almost hopeless task, for there is rarely a day when at some time the dust clouds do not roll over. Visibility approaches zero, and everything is covered again with a silt-like deposit which varies in depth from a film to actual ripples on the kitchen floor. If you look at the image that's on the left-hand side of your slide, what almost looks like mountains in the background is actually a dust storm. By 1933, unemployment rates reached 33% in Canada and 38% in the US. I'd like you to write down that statistic. By 1933, unemployment rates reached 33% in Canada and 38% in the US. The birth rate in both countries and in Western Europe, which had been declining for a century, dropped sharply during the first years of the Depression. Marriage rates dropped to their lowest point. How could a man take on the responsibility of a wife, conventional wisdom reasoned, when he couldn't support himself? Quote, "Do you realize how many people in my generation are not married?" a female Chicago educator told a historian 30 years afterward. "There were young men around when we were young, but they were all supporting their mothers." The Great Depression of the 1930s wasn't the first time the economy fell into a slump. North America had experienced major downturns in the 1870s, from 1913 to 1915, and 1920 to 1925. Because of past recessions, federal governments insisted that this crisis was temporary. President Herbert Hoover, underestimating the seriousness of the crisis, called it a passing incident in our national lives, reassuring that it would be over in 60 days. The pre-war depression was largely solved by World War I. I'd like you to write this down. Business picked up as industries stopped making household products and started making guns, uniforms, and tanks. Business picked up as industries stopped making household products and started making guns, uniforms, and tanks. The post-war depression was really just a return to pre-war conditions. The trouble was, workers had changed. Having survived the horrors of modern warfare, they weren't content to return to a life of unemployment and destitution. And they got angry. Please write this down. Their frustration triggered general strikes, union organizing, and radical politics. Their frustration triggered general strikes, union organizing, and radical politics. Radicalism in workers, a fear of communism, and pressure from social reformers forced governments to rethink its approach to social welfare, which up until this point had really been a municipal responsibility. Different municipalities responded to poverty differently. Some set up local poorhouses. Some set up local jails. And of course, all relied on private charities. In periods of economic crisis, municipalities usually tried to spend their way out. How did they do this? Well, they initiated public work projects. They would build roads, bridges, sewers, and parks. Unemployed men, rarely women, were hired to do the manual labor. Since masculinity was so closely tied to work, seeking relief was heavily stigmatized. In the US, the 20% who accepted government relief had to swallow their manly self-respect. As one engineer in the US put it in 1931, quote, "We'd lived on bread and water 3 weeks before I could make myself do it." In Canada, to be eligible, men had to prove they really needed the work. I'd like you to write this down, and I'll repeat it twice. This meant demonstrating they were the sole support for their family. So married men and veterans were given preference before single men. This meant demonstrating they were the sole support for their family. So married men and veterans were given preference before single men. As more men were put on the municipal register looking for work, the less possible it was to make a living wage. Any available work was spread around with different men selected each day. So if 5 jobs were available and 10 names on the list, registered men worked every 2 days. But if there were 100 names on the list, they'd only have work every 20 days. If a woman was married and her husband was unemployed and refused to sign up for relief, her only recourse was to have him charged with neglect and non-support. It was a man's responsibility to look after his wife and children. Authorities feared if women accessed relief on their own, it would create independence and encourage men to desert their families. I'd like you to write that down. I'll repeat it twice more. Authorities feared if women accessed relief on their own, it would create independence and encourage men to desert their families. Authorities feared if women accessed relief on their own, it would create independence and encourage men to desert their families. When the nation fell into an economic depression, governments were completely caught off guard. And by now, municipalities had already maxed out their budgets. Having bought their way out of the post-war depression, they simply had nothing left to spend on unemployment in the 1920s and early 1930s. So hundreds of municipalities declared bankruptcy. Private charity was a band-aid solution, and neither the provincial nor the federal government wanted responsibility for unemployment relief, or the debt it would inevitably incur. Since relief was administered municipally in Canada, there was no national standard for determining who qualified or how to qualify. By eligibility, I'd like you to write the following. It was based as much on financial need as your record of good citizenship. It was based as much on financial need as your record of good citizenship. In the countryside, individual relief officers had power to determine whether or not you qualified. Some gave relief only to families and not single people. Some gave relief to women, but not single men. Or sometimes the payment came in the form of work. In the 1930s, relief in Canada and the US came in the form of food vouchers or stamps rather than money. This guaranteed that money was only spent on groceries and not extravagances like beer. In Ontario, a relief applicant had to disconnect the telephone and turn in their driver's license in order to guarantee that taxpayers' money was not being wasted on luxuries. In Saskatchewan, you could be kicked off relief if you were caught purchasing alcohol. So there's a great deal of variety in what relief was and who could get it, and there was a great deal of scrutiny and control over the people who got assistance. Cheating might include a family hoarding a secret stash of potatoes in the basement, or cheating could be considered if someone found alcohol in your house.